Purposely. Your life, God's purpose. Listen at purposely.com.
Have you ever seen something so many times and then all of a sudden you see it again and there's a new detail you just never noticed? It was there the whole time, but you missed it, and now it changes the whole perspective for you. I think that's similar to the stories of the women in the early church. They were always there. I noticed the names and I quietly cheered to see women included, but I didn't see the whole picture. Women were risking and sacrificing and leading boldly at that time, prompted by their faith and love for God. To go back and really study these women out, considering the context to their situations and all that they contributed, there was so much there that I just didn't see at first. I'm Jen, by the way. This is the Bible for Busy People podcast, and this week we've been talking about women in the Bible who were prompted by faith, who acted on that faith, and were part of advancing God's purposes throughout history. Today we're reading about a few different women in the early church, and we're starting in Acts 16. In verse 11, it says, "From Troas, we put out to sea and sailed straight for Samothrace, and the next day we went on to Neapolis. From there, we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and the leading city of that district of Macedonia, and we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer in purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. 'If you consider me a believer in the Lord,' she said, 'come and stay at my house.' And she persuaded us." Later, at the bottom of the chapter in verse 40, it says, "After Paul and Silas came out of the prison," that's a whole story in itself, "they went to Lydia's house where they met with the brothers and sisters and encouraged them. Then they left." Now, Lydia was a businesswoman dealing in expensive, rare purple cloth in Philippi, Greece. As far as we can gather, she was a single woman who ran her own household. This wasn't extremely common at the time, but it also wasn't unusual. She believed in God and she responded to Paul's message, and then she and her household were baptized. She was a woman of influence and resources, and having her own household, each being their own community hub at the time, set her up perfectly as a leader of a house church. Later in verse 40, we see that brothers and sisters were gathered at Lydia's house. Fun fact, growing up, I dressed as Lydia for a church youth group costume party once. I couldn't resist wearing my favorite color at the time. But the most I considered Lydia to be good at was hospitality, and she was so much more than that. Also, we have another example in Romans chapter 6. In verse 1, it says, "I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Cenchreae." I'm probably saying that wrong. "I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people, and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me." Phoebe does not get a lot of airtime in the Bible, but there's a lot to her story that we can read between the lines. First, she's called a deacon of the church. This is from the Greek word diakonos, which has sometimes been translated as servant. However, elsewhere in the New Testament, it is translated and used to mean minister. This would have been someone who was a respected overseer in the church. Another word used to describe her is prostatus, which is translated here as benefactor, but elsewhere in the New Testament as leader or manager, which I would say goes with being a minister or respected overseer in the church. Finally, she was the one entrusted with bringing Paul's letter to the Roman church. This indicates a few things. First, that she had the means and resources to be able to travel at all. She had courage to take a long and probably dangerous journey herself. She would have been close in relationship to Paul, and he would have imparted on her the understanding and authority to give further detail as necessary. She would have thoroughly understood what he was trying to say and would have been representative of him in getting that point across, as if he was right there with them and telling them his letter himself. And finally, she would have been the one to read the letter to the church as though a teacher or preacher. And if not in reading the letter, it's likely she would have been one in her own right. Do you see what I mean about seeing the picture differently? When we get into some of these details and the context and the history, there's so much more to the stories of these women than just a cursory read through the Bible. Next up is in the same passage, Romans 16, but verses 3-5, which say, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus. They risked their lives for me. Not only I, but all the churches of the Gentiles are grateful to them. Greet also the church that meets at their house." Priscilla and her husband Aquila were a well-known tag team in the scriptures. Again, there is a lot to be said for Priscilla. She's named as a co-worker in Christ to Paul. In Romans 18, we also see that they were co-workers in the workplace too. They made tents together. Here we see that she and Aquila risked their lives for Paul. We know that to be a disciple at this time was contentious and risky. Paul's life certainly was constantly at risk. His dear friends were there for him in a dangerous time. Later in Acts 18, we see evidence of what Priscilla also was. She was a theologian, a teacher, and a church planter. She and her husband take initiative in a few different ways. In Acts 18, starting in verse 18, it says, "Paul stayed on in Corinth for some time. Then he left the brothers and sisters and sailed for Syria, accompanied by Priscilla and Aquila. Before he sailed, he had his hair cut off at Cenchreae because of a vow he had taken. They arrived at Ephesus, where Paul left Priscilla and Aquila. He himself went into the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. When they asked him to spend more time with them, he declined. But as he left, he promised, 'I will come back if it is God's will.' Then he set sail from Ephesus. When he landed at Caesarea, he went up to Jerusalem and greeted the church, and then went down to Antioch." Did not stay in one place long. Later in verse 24, it says, "Meanwhile, a Jew named Apollos, a native of Alexandria, came to Ephesus. He was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. He began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Priscilla and Aquila heard him, they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. When Apollos went to go to Achaia, the brothers and sisters encouraged him and wrote to the disciples there to welcome him. When he arrived, he was a great help to those who by grace had believed, for he vigorously refuted his Jewish opponents in public debate, proving from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah." They were part of starting the church of Ephesus. It's also unique at the time that Priscilla is often listed ahead of her husband. Greek culture and Roman culture did not respect the contributions of women or even acknowledge them typically. The church was radically different in that. It was even suggested that Priscilla could potentially be the anonymous author of Hebrews, although this has not been determined. We can tell that she was a dear friend because Paul refers to her by a nickname in 2 Timothy 4, verse 19. Prisca. There are many more women in the New Testament who left an impact, named and unnamed. We saw women traveling with Jesus and supporting him out of their own means. And likely there were women as leaders of their own households who also hosted house churches. Does this shift perspective for you? How amazing that women and men work together as co-laborers in Christ to build the church, and they still do that today. Thanks for talking with me this week about these amazing women. Let's talk again next week.
Thank you for listening to The Bible for Busy People. If you need prayer or want to go deeper in your faith, visit our show notes. Will you take a moment to share with a friend and leave a review? It helps the Bible get into even more people's minds and hearts. Find more podcasts that will recharge you at purposely.com.